Welcome to the third video podcast. In this podcast, we'll be learning about the ancient Greeks. In the introduction video, I discussed how the Parthenon had come to symbolize the history of Western civilization. This is because ancient Greece is so important to the development of Western culture and civilization. From the Greeks, we inherited political concepts such as democracy. We also owe much of our artistic and literary sensibilities to the pioneering work of the ancient Greeks in theater and poetic epics. Greek philosophy would bequeath ideas such as rational thought and rhetorical arguments, without which the scientific revolution and modern world would not have happened. In this podcast, we'll be covering the beginnings of civilization in the Aegean all the way up to the conquests of Alexander the Great. The learning objectives in this podcast are: number 1, explain the Aegean civilizations of the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and the early Greeks. Number 2, define the Greek polis or city-state. Number 3, identify the significance of Greek contributions to Western civilization in philosophy, art, literature, and government. And finally, explain the effects of Alexander of Macedon's conquests. The Greek civilization arose in the area of the Aegean Sea on the Mediterranean. This is a map of the Aegean Sea, which is in the southeast of Europe. Our earliest evidence for any civilization is sometime around the dawn of the Iron Age, which is around 1200 BCE. Although the Greeks were loosely connected by culture and language, for most of their early history they were not unified as a single civilization. Instead, they were independent and powerful city-states. In our lesson today, we will be examining the earliest civilizations in the area, the Minoan civilization and the Mycenaean civilization, both of which flourished in the Aegean region during the second millennium BCE. These two civilizations actually predate the classical Greek civilization, which ends up being so important. The first recorded civilization in the area was the Minoan civilization, and they were based here in the south on the island of Crete. They were followed by the Mycenaeans, who were on the Greek mainland over here, and who in turn likely conquered the Minoan Cretes sometime around 1490 BCE. The Minoan civilization flourished in the Middle Bronze Age. Now, we don't know much about their language except that it wasn't Greek. The written form first appears as hieroglyphs and later in a script which is yet to be deciphered. Thus, almost everything we know about them comes from archaeology and later stories and myths recorded by the civilizations that followed them. Hundreds of years after their civilization, the Greek poet Homer described one of their kings, King Minos, who kept the half-bull, half-man Minotaur in a labyrinth below his palace at Knossos. The Minoans were located on the island of Crete, south of the Greek mainland, in the eastern Mediterranean from 2000 BCE until around 1500 BCE, although the earliest evidence comes from around 3000 BCE. With their unique art and architecture, the spread of their ideas through contact with other cultures across the Aegean, the Minoans made a significant contribution to the development of Western civilization today. The image on the right is a picture of a masterpiece of Minoan art. Known today as La Parisienne, it shows a priestess in a long robe with her hair tied in a special knot. It is from a fresco, which means a wall painting, from the Capitol Palace at Knossos. It has been dubbed La Parisienne, or the Parisian lady, because of its elegance. The Minoans were also famous for their massive palace complexes, vivid frescoes depicting scenes such as bull leaping and processions, fine gold jewelry, elegant stone vases, and pottery with vibrant decorations of marine life. They were also possibly the oldest civilization of Western Europe, and their language could reveal more about a people and a culture that was the foundation on which ancient Greek and ultimately the Roman culture would be later built. The Minoans disappeared suddenly, and this is also a mystery. It has been suggested that they experienced some form of a cataclysmic event. Their decline began around 1550 BCE. The theories for their disappearance include invasions from the mainland Greece, from the civilizations of the Mycenaeans, and perhaps a major volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Santorini. The Mycenaeans were the first Greeks. In other words, they were the first people that we know of that spoke an early form of the Greek language. Indeed, their written language may be the first written example of an Indo-European language. Indo-European is the language group to which nearly every European language belongs. Not surprisingly, Mycenaean culture was heavily influenced by the Minoans who preceded them. Here you see two examples of pottery, one Minoan, one Mycenaean. The similarity between the two in style is clear. Mycenaean wares typically display stylized representations of marine and plant life and show a fondness for minimalist linear designs, a trend which would go on to influence the early pottery of the later ancient Greek civilizations. The Mycenaeans lived in fortified palaces, and war was a regular part of their lives. Here you can see the image of the famous Lion Gate at the ruins of the city of Mycenae. Carved around 1250 BCE above the main gate of the citadel's massive walls, the lions, flanking a column, their front paws resting on altars, probably represented royal authority. The Lion Gate is the sole surviving monumental piece of Mycenaean sculpture. The Mycenaeans, like the ancient Greek civilization that followed, lived in independent city-states. Each city had its own ruler, and they were often at war with one another. Some of the most famous of these city-states we learn about from later Greek legends. Mycenae, right here, was home of the legendary King Agamemnon from the Iliad. Tiryns, just to the southeast, was the home of Hercules from Greek mythology. And Pylos, down to the southwest, was the home of the old King Nestor from the Iliad. Another important aspect of their culture was determined by geography. Since Greece is mountainous, the best form of transportation is the sea. The Mycenaeans were seafaring people. All of the city-states were close to the sea, but far enough away that should the city be attacked, the inhabitants would have time to react. The later Greek poem written by Homer, the Iliad, tells about an attack on the citadel of Troy, which is over here. The later Greek poem suggests that the people that were doing the attacking were called the Aegeans, who were Greek. It is possible that the Mycenaeans are these Greeks. I'll discuss this story in a moment in a later slide. By 1100 BCE, it was all gone. The Mycenaean palaces were destroyed, and their system of writing, their art, and their way of life were gone. The causes of their decline are not entirely clear. According to Greek legends, they were replaced by half-civilized Dorian invaders from the north. The Dorians were another Greek-speaking people, but they had no written culture, and we know very little about their early history. Most historians believe that it was not the Dorian invasions alone which spelled the end of the Mycenaeans. Around the same time that the Mycenaean civilization collapsed, there began a crisis which affected numerous Mediterranean civilizations, including the Egyptians. For nearly a century in the second millennium BCE, a mysterious band of maritime warriors known as the Sea Peoples wreaked havoc on the Mediterranean. One ancient inscription reads, "They came from the sea in their warships, and none could stand against them." There are accounts of the Sea People attacking Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Palestine. They may have even toppled the mighty Hittite Empire. Yet despite the indelible mark they left on history, scholars know almost nothing about their culture or nationality. What little information historians do have on the Sea Peoples comes from the civilizations that fought wars against them, most notably the ancient Egyptians. According to Egyptian writings, the pharaoh Ramses III defeated the Sea Peoples in a major battle around 1178 BCE, after which time the Sea Peoples disappear from history. The troubles from the Sea Peoples also happen around the same time that the Dorian Greeks from the north begin to invade the southern Mycenaean civilization. The result was the end of the Mycenaean civilization and the beginning of a period of a dark age for the Greeks, during which historians know very little about what was going on. Sometime around 750 BCE, Greece began to emerge from these dark ages. Historians have dubbed the period that followed the Archaic period. The word archaic derives from the Greek word archaios, which means old, and refers to the period in ancient Greek history before the classical period. The Archaic period is generally considered to have lasted from the beginning of the 8th century BCE until the beginning of the 5th century BCE. In the Archaic period, Greeks settled across the Mediterranean and the Black Seas, as far as Marseille in the west and Trapezus in the southeastern coast of the Black Sea. By the end of the Archaic period, they were part of a trade network that spanned the entire Mediterranean. The Archaic period began with a massive increase in the Greek population and a series of significant changes. The period saw developments in Greek politics, economics, international relations, warfare, and culture. It laid the groundwork for the classical period both politically and culturally. The first thing we notice are improvements in agriculture, a shift away from herding animals to growing crops. Greeks also began to make better use of their geography by building terraced hillsides and draining marshes. It was during the Archaic period that the Greek alphabet developed and writing returned to the Greek world. The alphabet was based on the earlier Phoenician alphabet, which we discussed briefly in the last unit. It was also during this period that the hoplite became the core of Greek armies. Hoplites were citizen soldiers of ancient Greek city-states who were primarily armed with spears and shields. Here you see a detail from a Corinthian vase that shows pike-wielding hoplites closed in battle over a fallen comrade. In this image and elsewhere, Greek artists tended to render the warriors semi-nude and fighting in small groups, but in reality hoplites went into battle wearing heavy armor and fought in large units. Now, the hoplites were not professional soldiers. Rather, they were made up of free Greek citizens, propertied artists and farmers, who were able to afford the bronze armor and the weapons. The other military innovation which would define the Greek armies was the phalanx formation. The phalanx was a rectangular mass military formation. Hoplite soldiers utilized the phalanx formation in order to be effective in war with fewer soldiers. The formation discouraged the soldiers from acting alone, for this would compromise the formation and minimize its strengths. Each individual hoplite carried his shield on his left arm, protecting not only himself, but also the soldier to the left. This meant that the men at the extreme right of the phalanx were only half protected. In battle, opposing phalanxes would try to exploit this weakness by attempting to overlap the enemy's right flank. It also meant that in battle, a phalanx would tend to drift to the right as hoplites sought to remain behind the shield of their neighbor. It was also during this time that some of the greatest works of Greek literature were created: the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer is the legendary author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, two epic poems that are the central works of ancient Greek literature. About Homer the man, we know almost nothing. However, the poetry he wrote continues to resonate with audiences today. You might have seen the movie version of the Iliad starring Brad Pitt called Troy. For a long time, these tales were considered legends and nothing more. However, in the 19th century, a wealthy German, Heinrich Schliemann, was obsessed with the tales of Homer, and he funded a massive expedition to find the ruins of the lost city of Troy. He successfully excavated the ruins, which were found in Turkey. Troy was later added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1998. The heroic and aristocratic values of the Iliad and the Odyssey would influence Greek antiquity for centuries. It was also during the Archaic period that Greece developed its most defining organizational characteristic, the polis. The polis was an independent city-state. They came about partially due to Greece's geography. The heartland of Greek civilization was a mountainous terrain with a rugged coastline and numerous islands, and this encouraged political fragmentation. Although each individual polis had their own political identity, there were several features which one could say were common to all. Generally speaking, a polis consisted of an urban center, usually fortified, and with another center built on a natural acropolis or harbor, and this controlled the surrounding rural territory. In the early period, each polis tended to be ruled by an elite council of aristocratic men. These were men that were born into their roles. Regular people had no role to play. However, occasionally individual aristocratic men seized control and ruled as dictators. Called tyrants, the term today has a more negative meaning than it did to the Greeks. Tyrants were frequently very popular as they stood up to their fellow aristocrats in defense of the poor. While there were city-states or polises throughout the Aegean, three states in particular rose to particular prominence: Corinth, Sparta, and Athens. Frequently at war with one another, each of these three city-states developed their own unique character. A rare moment of peace between city-states was the Olympics. The ancient Olympic Games were originally a festival or celebration of and for the god Zeus. Events such as a foot race, a javelin contest, and wrestling matches were added later. The first Olympics is traditionally dated to 776 BCE. During the celebration of the Games, an Olympic truce was enacted so athletes could travel from their cities to the Games in safety. The prizes for the victors were in olive leaf wreaths or crowns. The Games became a political tool used by city-states to assert dominance over their rivals. They were later suppressed once the Romans conquered Greece. Then, in the 19th century, the Olympic Games were revived into their modern form. As we move from the Archaic period of Greek history to the Classical period, we reach the zenith of Greek power, influence, and culture. It was a period in which art, sculpture, and architecture flourished. For example, the Parthenon in Athens was constructed during this time. In many ways, the Classical period of Greek history is the Athenian period, for it is in Athens that most of the biggest developments took place. The first significant event of the period occurred in 508 BCE with the fall of the last Athenian tyrant and the beginning of Cleisthenes' reforms. Cleisthenes was an ancient Athenian aristocrat credited with reforming the constitution of ancient Athens and setting it on a democratic path in 508 BCE. For these accomplishments, historians sometimes refer to him as the father of Athenian democracy. The word democracy comes from two Greek words meaning the people, demos, and rule, kratos. Thus, democracy means rule by the people. However, the Greek idea of democracy was quite different from present-day democracy in several ways. First, participation in Cleisthenes' new democracy was limited to citizens. Only free men were considered citizens in Athens. Women, children, and slaves were not considered citizens and therefore could not vote. According to Cleisthenes' reforms, each year 500 names were chosen from all the citizens of ancient Athens. Those 500 citizens had to actively serve in a government council for 1 year. During that year, they were responsible for making new laws and controlled all parts of the political process. However, when a new law was proposed, all of the citizens of Athens, that is, all the free men over 20 years of age, had the opportunity to vote on it. To vote, citizens had to attend the assembly on the day that the vote took place. This form of government is called direct democracy. A direct and active democracy is one in which every single law is voted individually by the citizens. This is, of course, very different from how democracy works in Canada and most other countries today. We live in a representative democracy. That is, a government in which citizens vote for representatives who create and change laws that govern people, rather than getting to vote directly on the laws themselves. A final interesting aspect of the reforms of Cleisthenes was the concept of ostracism. Ostracism was a procedure under the Athenian democracy in which any citizen could be expelled from the city-state of Athens for 10 years. Each year the Athenians were asked in the assembly whether they wished to hold an ostracism, and the names would be put up to a vote. It was used as a way of neutralizing someone who was thought to be a threat to the state or a potential future tyrant. Here you see the statue of a reclining Dionysus, which was originally from the Parthenon's east side, built around 447 to 433 BCE. Sadly, most of the sculptures from the Parthenon were removed by the British, and they are now on display at the British Museum. The culture of Greece during this period proved hugely influential. These were some of the most technically proficient sculptures yet, and it set the standard for all future work. The Greek word philosophy means the love of wisdom. Ancient Greek philosophy was the ancient Greeks' attempt to make sense of the world in a non-religious way. So rather than using myths to understand the world, they used their intelligence and reasoning skills. Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle dealt with a wide variety of subjects including political philosophy, ethics, metaphysics, ontology, logic, biology, rhetoric, and aesthetics. Greek theater began in the 6th century BCE in Athens with the performance of tragedy plays at religious festivals. The plot of a tragedy was almost always inspired from episodes of Greek mythology, which we must remember was part of the Greek religion. As a consequence of the very serious subject matter, which often dealt with moral rights and wrongs and tragic no-win dilemmas, these were obviously somewhat sad plays to watch. However, they in turn inspired the Greek genre of comedy plays. These two types of Greek drama would be hugely popular, and performances spread around the Mediterranean and influenced Hellenistic and Roman theater. It was also in ancient Greece that the very first historians lived. Herodotus wrote about the wars between Persia and Greece, and Thucydides wrote about the civil war between Athens and Sparta. Together, these ancient Greek writers became the first true historians in Western civilization. As Greece's confidence and influence grew, the collection of city-states faced its greatest test yet with the Persian invasions of the 5th century BCE. The Persian Empire was the largest and most powerful empire in the world at that time, and they controlled land that stretched from Egypt all the way to India. The first Persian invasion of Greece ended with a decisive Athenian victory at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Now, there is a legend associated with this battle that a runner was sent from the battlefield of Marathon to Athens to announce that the Persians had been defeated. It is said that he ran the entire distance without stopping and then burst into the assembly, gave his message, and collapsed and died. The rough distance between Marathon and Athens was 26 miles, giving the inspiration for the first marathon event held in the 19th century. However, the accuracy of this legend has been seriously questioned by historians, so take it with a grain of salt. The earliest reference to it was over 500 years after the battle. The second Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC, as King Xerxes of Persia sought to conquer all of Greece, was even worse. The invasion forced many of the Greek city-states to join together to defeat the Persians. The Athenians and the Spartans led the Greek resistance. The Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE has become the archetype for the courageous last stand. Depicted in the movie 300, legend has it that 300 Spartan soldiers defended a narrow mountain pass against a larger force of Persians. Some ancient sources say it was over 1 million strong, the Persians, although these numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Eventually, the war turned to the Greek cause, and the Greeks would expel the Persians from Europe, the Aegean Islands, and Ionia before the war finally came to an end in 479 BCE. Here you see the view of the Thermopylae Pass today. Now, in ancient times, the coastline would have been much closer, probably about roughly where the modern road on the right-hand side of the picture is now, or even closer to the mountain. So it would have been a narrow pass then, but nowadays the coast is quite far away. Soon after the success at stopping the Persian invasions, the Greek city-states began to turn on one another in a series of wars which lasted nearly a century. Initially, Athens took a leadership role and organized the pan-city-state organization, the Delian League, which was formed as a safeguard against future Persian invasions. However, the Athenians also used it as an empire of sorts. They ruthlessly crushed city-states that resisted membership. Eventually, this growing power of Athens and the Delian League led to the Peloponnesian War, in which Sparta and other city-states went to war against Athens. By the time the fighting had finally subsided, Sparta was victorious and Athens defeated. However, the power of classical Greece as a whole had begun to wane. Here you see a map of the Greek world during the Peloponnesian War, which lasted nearly 30 years. During the long and bloody Peloponnesian War, much of the Greek world was divided into two camps, one led by Sparta and the other by Athens. In the decades that followed, leadership of the Greek world would fall to a barbarian kingdom on its borders, Macedon, which you'll see up here. Macedon was an ancient kingdom on the periphery of Greece, which was generally thought of as a barbarian kingdom by the classical Greek polises. Macedon did speak a dialect of Greek, and its culture was closely aligned in many ways with the city-states to the south. It would be from Macedon in the north where cultural leadership would pass next in a young man named Alexander. Tutored by Aristotle himself, Alexander and his father, Philip, the king of Macedon, would begin by conquering much of the Greek world. Alexander ruthlessly pursued power and became a great military leader, renowned for his bravery in battle. Between 359 and 323 BCE, the armies of Macedon conquered first the Greek city-states and then the Persian Empire. Macedonian power extended from Greece and Egypt eastward to modern India. The conquest of Alexander the Great would extend Greek culture far beyond the Aegean. In many ways, his empire redefined what it meant to be Greek. As the Greek language and culture became entrenched across the Mediterranean and Anatolia, the Greek identity became one defined by language and culture and not by birth. In areas in which Alexander set up Greek kingdoms, the elites of the province often became Hellenized, while ordinary people retained local ways. This created a two-tiered linguistic system, with Greek at the top. Over time, Greek became a language of trade and administration over a vast portion of the ancient world. After the death of Alexander, his massive Greek empire lost all of its political stability. Soon, those fragments of the Alexandrian Empire had become three powerful dynasties. The first of those kingdoms was the Seleucid Empire of Syria and Persia. The second were the Ptolemies of Egypt, with the city of Alexandria, named after, well, you know who, and finally, the Antigonids of Greece and Macedonia. Each of these mini-empires were led by Greeks. In particular, the Greek-speaking leaders of Egypt, the Ptolemies, would continue for centuries until the death of Cleopatra finally brought that to an end in the era of Julius Caesar and the beginning of the Roman Empire. The Hellenistic kingdoms, as they came to be known, continued the work of Alexander the Great in solidifying the importance of Greek culture. And it was due to these kingdoms that the Greek language continued to be one of the main languages of the ancient world long after the heyday of the Greek civilization. In fact, 2 units from now, we will see how the Greek culture and language outlasted even the Roman Empire, becoming the cultural bedrock of the medieval Byzantine Empire. So, in short, the Greek civilization was profoundly important to the history of Western civilization. Their political legacy, literature, philosophy, and arts and architecture all profoundly influenced our world. Next, we will turn our attention to the inheritors of Greek culture, the Romans, in our next unit.